suppressing the truth. They are seeking to destroy the places where Yahweh, the true God, is worshipped. They have been putting the prophets of Yahweh to death. And even Elijah, as he says here, he's been being chased by Queen Jezebel. His life is being hunted. He's being hunted, and they're seeking to put him to death. It's a very dark time. And Elijah thinks he's the only worshiper of Yahweh left. He thinks he's the only one holding on faithfully to the worship of God. And in that dark time of national apostasy and defiance, God corrects Elijah. He says, actually, Elijah, you're not the only one left. I've elected 7,000 Israelites, Jews, who have not kissed the lips of Baal, who have not kissed that idol, who have not worshipped that false god. They are my people. I have chosen them to be mine, and they are faithful to me. So, Elijah, there's 7,001 of you who are my people. I have selected you as a remnant to be my people. And so the point is, God's choosing for himself those 7,000 means that even in the dark time of apostasy, when sin and idolatry is ruling amongst the Jews, and they are fully participating in this as a nation and as a people, God has not and did not reject all his people then. Instead, he saved a remnant, a small group for himself that was true worshipers. Therefore, he goes on to his fourth piece of evidence that God has not rejected all the Jews, and that is a present remnant of Jewish believers. Verse 5. So based on the scripture he just gave, an example he gave, and God's action that he gave from 1 Kings, he then says this in verse 5. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. So as most of the Jews in the first century were being disobedient to the gospel, they were hearing it, but they were not going on to the next step of believing it and then calling upon the name of the Lord. They were rejecting the Messiah, the fulfillment of that promise. God was still choosing a remnant. He was still choosing a group to believe, a people from among the Jews who would be his people. So Acts chapter 2, verse 41 tells us that on the day of Pentecost, through Peter's preaching, 3,000 Jews believe. 3,000 come to faith in Christ, acknowledging Jesus as the Messiah. In Acts chapter 3, verse 4, reports the number of believing Jewish Christians grew to 5,000. In Acts chapter 6, verse 7, it reports a large number of Jewish priests became believers. So the existence of this remnant of believing Jews, this minority of believing Jews, of whom Paul was one, evidence that God had not totally rejected his people. Yet it is emphasized that this existence of Jewish Christians in the first century, this remnant, is by God's grace. It's not because they deserve it. It's not because they're better than other people. It's because of God's gracious choosing and not by any effort on their part. So Paul mentions this and emphasizes this. He said they were a remnant chosen by grace in verse 5, and then in verse 6 he says, and if by grace, then it cannot be based on works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. So in being chosen and becoming one of God's people, grace and works are mutually exclusive. You cannot become one of God's people by your own efforts, your own works, by the law. It's not because one has believed and obeyed that you were chosen to be one of God's people. No, it's because God in grace foreknew and chose that person apart from anything that they have done, that they then believe and call on the name of the Lord. That's the proper order there. That's what happens. Grace is given, then they believe. It's not because they work and try and do all kinds of things, then grace is given. No, that's not the way it works. So those four pieces of evidence: one, Paul is a believing Jew himself. Two, God has foreknown his people. Three, Scripture shows in the past that when times got very dark and there was mass apostasy and unbelief, God still saved and kept and chose his remnant. And then fourthly, there was a present remnant. Even as the gospel went out, even though many Jews refused to believe, there were a number that did believe in the Messiah, Jesus. So this shows God has not rejected his people. They rejected the Jews as his people. So the question then is, Paul asks in verse 7, what then? Well, that question may be more clearly stated for us in this way. Since God has not responded to the disobedience of the Jews and their unbelief in the first century by not totally rejecting them, what does that mean for the Jews as the people of God? So that's what he's asking now. What does it mean for them as the people of God, since he has not decided to just cast them all away? Well, it means several things. Paul mentions three here in the text. First of all, he mentions that the people of Israel as a group did not gain what they sought so hard to get. So that's verse 7a. It says, what then? What the people of Israel sought so earnestly, they did not obtain. So what was the people as a whole? What was the group of Jews or the nation as a whole seeking so hard? Well, they were seeking righteousness. They were seeking approval by God. They were seeking acceptance by God, but they were accepting that, trying to earn and attain that righteousness by the law. That's what if we turn back to chapter 9, verse 31, that's what it tells us. It says, but the people of Israel who pursued the law as a way of righteousness have not attained their goal. And as chapter 10, verse 3 states, they sought to establish their own righteousness. So what Israel sought to gain or attain by themselves is righteousness by the law. That is, to be justified before God by their own effort, by obeying all the law. But that is impossible. It cannot be done, as we have learned and has been stated many times through this letter that Paul wrote to the Romans. So that was the first thing that this means for the Jews as of the people of God. Many of them did not get the righteousness because they tried to get it the wrong way. They were rejected in that sense. Secondly, within the people of Israel, it was the elect or the chosen Jews who gained righteousness. So this is chapter 11, verse 7b. It says, the elect among them did. So just before that says, what the people of Israel sought so earnestly, they did not obtain, but the elect among them did. Due to God's grace and his sovereign act of mercy, he chose from among all of the Jews, all those people. He says, I'm choosing some of them to remain and be my people. And they're going to hear the gospel and they will believe. And so they did. And they called on the name of the Jesus. And so they were justified. They were granted the righteousness that comes by faith. Now, mentioning the elect reminds us of what Paul had wrote earlier in Romans 9, 7 to 13. That there are two Israels, and we always have to keep remembering this. There is the physical Israel, the broad Israel that is encompassed or made up of all the Jews, all the ethnic group. Whether or not they're a nation is irrelevant. You can have a whole group of people and they're not necessarily a nation or don't necessarily take that form of organization. At sometimes, yes, the Jews took the form of an organizational status of a nation. So this is all physical Israel. Well, again, all the ethnic descendants, genetic descendants of Israel. Whether they're in a nation or not doesn't matter. That's physical Israel. Spiritual Israel is those whom God has selected out of or within physical Israel to believe in him, to receive his righteousness, that gift through faith. These are the people whom God selects, the Jews he selected, to actually give and grant the fulfillment of the promises that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and grants to them, these Jews, the actual knowledge and personal knowledge of him. So those within physical Israel who actually are the elect, who are the chosen, who actually gain the righteousness because they believe the Messiah and call on the Messiah, Jesus, they are spiritual Israel. And spiritual Israel, who is spiritual Israel, is revealed by which Jews embrace the gospel. So the Jews that do not embrace the gospel, they simply remain physical Israel. The Jews that embrace the gospel, they then are made known as the spiritual Israel. But what about the rest? Well, that's what it says in verse 7b. What about those who hear but they don't believe, they don't call on the name of the Lord? It says the rest, they're rejected, they're hardened. That's verse 7. So the rest of the Jews of the first century who refuse to believe but stubbornly persist on trying to gain righteousness by the law, which cannot be done, refusing the Messiah Christ, they are passed over in their sin. They are passed over and they are judged. They are hardened. Using the language of Romans 1 to explain the hardening, God gives them over to their sinful desires, their sinful disobedience, and thus to self-destruction. Paul has already proven in chapter 9, verses 14 to 18, that God is free, and in his choosing of some spiritual Israel to save them, and leaving the rest, rejecting them, passing them over in judgment, is not unjust. Because his choice to save some and not others is not a choice of justice. It's not based on what people deserve. If it's based on what people deserve, all would be condemned. His choice to save some is based on mercy. So he has done nothing wrong, nothing unjust. Now, composing a quote from Isaiah chapter 29 and verse 10 and Deuteronomy chapter 29 verse 4, Paul makes a quote from those two sources in verse 8 of Romans 11. He says, again, to back up this, the hardening of the others, and he says, as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that could not see, and ears that could not hear, to this very day. So this quote of the Old Testament is affirming that it is God who in judgment hardens those who refuse to believe. And the result is spiritual blindness, spiritual deafness, so that as the gospel is preached, they hear it, but they don't actually really hear it and will not believe. They hear it audibly, physically, but spiritually they cannot understand. They cannot accept it. They only refuse it. And this judicial work of God, or this work of God's judgment on his people, the Jews, Paul was quoting from Isaiah and Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is not long after God formed the people of Israel, the Hebrews, into that nation of Israel. So he's saying this judicial work of God of hardening some of them has been going on since basically Israel began. And it was still continuing even in Isaiah's day. And it was still continuing, as Paul said, to this very day, which he meant the first century. And then, as we will see later in Romans 11, verse 25, it's still continuing on today. This act of God where he is still calling a remnant of Jewish people to himself. To be spiritual Israel is still happening, but there's still a large number, even today, rejecting the gospel. So this explains this. That's God's judicial act. The other quote that Paul presents is from Psalm 69, verse 22 to 23, and he is quoting this in verse 9 and 10 of Romans 11. So he says, and David says, may their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. May their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and their backs be bent forever. This quote from Psalm 69 is a quote or a prayer of David, a psalm of David. And as he's praying to God, he's praying about enemies, people who are opposing him. But he's not talking about external enemies like the Philistines or the Assyrians or the Phoenicians or whoever. He's actually saying, God, I'm talking to you about my enemies who come from within Israel, who are my kinsmen, who may even be within my own family, who may be even within, those whom he has appointed to be in his leadership and rule of the kingdom of Israel that David was king over. And so he is speaking to God about enemies who are related to him. This Psalm 69 is often quoted in the New Testament to apply to Jesus, to the Messiah. Jesus himself quotes Psalm 69 verse 4 about being hated without reason in John chapter 15 verse 25. Psalm 69 verse 21 about being given vinegar to drink for your thirst is applied to Jesus at the cross in John 19, 28 to 29. So in the first century, as many Jews rejected Jesus, the true King of Israel, the true Davidic Messiah and King, Psalm 69's reference of divine judgment and blindness that David calls upon his own relatives or kinsmen who are opposing him as the King of Israel, then can apply to the unbelieving Jews of the first century of Paul's day who were rejecting the ultimate King of Israel, the ultimate Son of David, the ultimate Davidic Messiah. So he's applying that to them here. So in summary of what then, if God has not totally rejected his people, but only partially, what then does this mean for the Jews as God's people? Well, this is what it means in summary. Though most Jews in the first century rejected God's righteousness that is by faith, that is made known and received through faith in Jesus, as we hear the gospel, that didn't lead to a total rejection of of the Jews by God. It meant that yes, the Jews who persist in seeking a righteousness by the law, they will be hardened, they will be given over to judgment, they are rejected. But not rejecting all Jews, God is in mercy still choosing from among physical Israel, spiritual Israel, Jews who will hear the gospel, who will be his people, who will be a spiritual people who do believe and call on the Messiah that he has sent, and are then gifted the righteousness that they need by faith. Now, when we began Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11, particularly when we began Romans 9, and I introduced this to you, this section to you, you may remember me saying that first Sunday and also the second Sunday, I said to you, everything that we think about modern Israel, the modern state of Israel that was created in 1945, and all the stuff that has gone on since it was created about the Israelis and the Middle East and all that stuff that's going on then and now, I said you need to take it all, put it in a bag and throw it away for a time being. We need to put it aside. And the reason is because if we did not, all of what we think we know and all the biases and all the opinions and all the different events that have gone on in the last 70, 80 years are going to influence our understanding and interpretation of these texts of what Paul is teaching us about the Jews in the first century, 2,000 years ago. And therefore, if we let what's occurred in the last 80 years and we read that back into the text, we're going to misunderstand the text, misinterpret it, and misapply it. I said we need to put that aside. So we first go through and understand what Paul is saying about the Jews and the people of God in the first century. And once we understand that, then we may begin to apply that to our current day and age. I think we have been able to, at this point, having gone through Romans 9, Romans 10, and we're into Romans 11, we may now are able to allow Paul's understanding of what he's taught us about Israel or the Jews as a group in the first century to now begin to help us understand what to think about and how to shape how we should think about the Jewish people as a whole today, or as a nation or group today. Here are only two thoughts. As we keep going through Romans 11, Paul is actually going to bring out some other thoughts of application and how we should think of the Jews and Gentiles together and the people of God. But here are two things as a way of introduction. Number one, as in the first century, we must not view the Jews of today, or the modern nation today, as one general group where whatever applies to one applies to them all. Let me say that again. As in the first century, we must not see all the Jews today as one general group where whatever applies to one applies to them all. Notice that after discussing the general question of did God reject his people as a whole, showing that yes, God has not rejected all of them, but only some. He's only been a partial rejection. Paul stops his generalization. In chapter 11, verse 7 to 10, he distinguishes, he divides again Israel, the people of God in the first century, into two distinct groups. The elect who are saved and the unbelieving Jews who are hardened. Or again, physical Israel and spiritual Israel. And what is said about one cannot be said about the other. You cannot say all physical Israel is saved and is saved. They're not. They're being hardened, many of them. Spiritual Israel is receiving righteousness. They have received righteousness. But physical Israel is not. He says they're not obtaining it. One has true righteousness, the other does not. One is truly God's people, the other is not. So the difference between the two groups is how they have responded to the gospel of Jesus. That's what distinguishes them. That which is what divides them. So if I am understanding this correctly, if I'm interpreting and implying things correctly, I think today we cannot generally say physical Israel, the Jews as a whole, the nation as a whole, are God's chosen people. Because God's not saving all of them. He's rejected many of them. But neither can we say the opposite either. We cannot say there's no Jew, no Israelite that is not God's people. Because God has not rejected all of them. He is saving a number of them, a remnant for himself. They are his chosen spiritual Israel, or spiritual people. There exists within physical Israel his spiritual chosen people by his own choice and mercy. So that's the first thing that I think that is important for us as we try to wrestle with this whole concept of, okay, who is God's people? What does that mean for the Jews then as it is applied now? Is we must not simply, like in the first century, they didn't lump them all together and whatever happens to one happens to them all. Yes, I think we need to also do that and think that through today. The second thing that we can say is that evangelization of Jews, the Jewish people, what's evangelization? That is the proclaiming, the speaking of the message of the gospel, and that is the message about Jesus, with the aim to persuade. That's evangelism. It's the speaking of the gospel with the aim to persuade. So the point is, evangelization of Jews must continue today. We still must be sending, just as in the first century. sending people to the Jews with the intent to tell them the gospel message so that they may hear and they still may have opportunity to believe and call on the name of Christ. As it was seen in the dark days of Elijah, God still had his people who were still Jewish. He had reserved 7,001 for himself. In the first century, through Paul and many others, he was calling many Jews to himself to be his people. And he's still doing that today. So even though generally the Jewish people over the last couple of millennia have not responded in great numbers to the gospel, that doesn't matter. There's still a number of them that are God's people whom he is saving, that he has foreknown, that he is choosing, and we must tell them the gospel. So this necessitates a continuing of sending people to proclaim the gospel of Jesus among the Jews, so that they may hear